Tonight's tale. You never know what you might dig up in your backyard. The communication, part 3. I awoke to the sun blazing through the window of the bedroom and onto my face. I must have eventually drifted off to sleep, despite the fever and uneasy feelings last night. I rubbed the sleep out of my eyes and looked over at the little electric clock on my nightstand to see what time it was. 12:35 p.m. I had really slept in. No wonder the sun was so bright. Feeling slightly groggy, despite the length of time that I must have been asleep, I rolled over, my arm laying back onto James's side of the bed. James's empty pillow. Of course he wasn't in bed. It was afternoon on a Sunday. What did surprise me was that his side of the bed was perfectly made. That wasn't like him at all. Usually he gets out of bed while I'm still sleeping, and I straightened it up when I wake up. This morning, though, he seems to have done his best to make his side of the bed without waking me up and letting me sleep in. He was really thoughtful like that. I stretched again and climbed out of bed, pulling the blankets and sheets on my side of the bed taut and fixing the pillows before making my way to the bedroom to brush my teeth. After being asleep for so long, I was pretty sure I must have dragon's breath going on. There was no need to turn on the bathroom light when I opened the door, and I started brushing my teeth just like every other morning. James. He must feel really bad about last night. He even took the towels from his shower out of the bathroom and put them in the laundry for me while I slept. Usually, he would just hang them up on the back of the door and they would inevitably fall into a crumpled heap whenever the door was opened. But it even looked like he washed out the shower and the sink. Returning to the bedroom, I stripped off my pyjamas and got dressed for the day. Scooping up my discarded sleepwear, I turned to drop them into the laundry hamper, only to find it empty. Had he even done the laundry? How sweet was he? I threw my clothes into the hamper and made my way down the little hallway to the stairs, thoughts of coffee swimming around in my head. Sure, it was already well into the afternoon, but I had my routine, and routine called for coffee after waking up. I made my way down the stairs, then down the hall towards the kitchen, instinctively moving to one side of the hallway to avoid the picture frames that had been stacked up there, and I stopped again. They were gone from their little orderly pile on the floor. Oh, James! He had finally hung them up on the wall while I slept. And he managed to do it without waking me up with the banging of the hammer into the wall. I took a step back to admire them as they hung on the wall, perfectly level in their little frames. Our wedding photo with James in his tuxedo, his monkey suit, as he called it, his hair pulled back into a ponytail, secured with a little black cord, and me standing next to him awkwardly in my dress, feeling out of place next to the Adonis that had become my husband. A caricature of the two of us that was done by a street artist when we cruised the boardwalk on our last trip to the Lost Coast 2 years ago. A painting, beautiful painting, that my father had done of a native woman on horseback in the woods. A series of smaller frames showing little moments from our life together. It was perfect, and exactly what I had hoped it would all be. Finally, a little something that made this house feel like a home we shared, rather than just a place that we slept, or the blank white walls of a rented apartment. Even though we had bought this house nearly 2 years ago now, there wasn't much that you could really identify as homey. The walls throughout the place were all the same, off-white colour with textured paint that you would find in any rented space. The carpet upstairs were still the same off-brownish colour of carpet bought on the cheap. We had hung no pictures or posters or shelves or anything else, really. If it weren't for the occasional areas of clutter here and there from where James would carelessly put things down, you might not know anyone actually lived here at all. Our house definitely had a very pre-furnished unit kind of feel to it. I was so sick of that feeling and wanted to start making it into a space that really felt like a home. This was a good start, and my spirits were lifted as I made my way into the kitchen to start a cup of coffee. That's what I loved about James, I reflected. We could fight and have an argument, and then he'd go out of his way to make up for it. That's probably where he was right now, actually. I looked out the door from the kitchen into the driveway, while waiting for the machine to spit out my liquid hot bean juice into the waiting mug, and noticed that his car wasn't in the driveway. It was unusual for him to go out on a Saturday without him telling me about it, but then again, it was unusual for me to sleep so late. I was sure when I checked my phone there would be a message from him letting me know where he went and when he'd be back, so I didn't have to worry about it. Coffee in hand, I made my way back upstairs to head to my office and decided to skip breakfast since it was already so late in the day. I'd make a late lunch or maybe an early dinner, depending on when James got home. As I settled into my chair and booted up the computer, I wondered if he would be home in time to visit the local shelter today, since they were closed on Sundays. As I checked my email for any news or word from my editor, I realised that he had probably forgotten we were meant to go meet a few animals this weekend, what with the overtime he had to work and our silly little fight. I couldn't really be upset at him for that. It was a lot to keep track of, and despite my best efforts, I could never get him to use the calendar app that I had set up on both of our phones, so eventually I just stopped putting things into the calendar myself. It just led to more fights anyway, when he'd forget something. I'd say it was on the calendar, he'd get upset about that. It was a whole mess. After checking my email and social media accounts, who could have ever guessed that being a writer meant you'd have to manage social media accounts for just about everything? I went back into the bedroom to get my phone and finally check for that text from James that I knew would be waiting for me. And, sure enough, there was a text from James sent at 5:03 this morning. It read, "Hi beautiful, I got called into work. Some emergency at the shop. Don't know when I'll be home. Don't wait for me. I love you, James." Poor James! This job was really starting to run him ragged, calling him in at all hours of the day and night, even on the weekends. I hoped he would at least not be so stubborn about ordering a lunch this time, since I didn't pack him one last night. And maybe he was awake enough this morning to grab some of the leftovers in the fridge to take with him. With my day suddenly wide open and an empty house that didn't need cleaning, I saw no reason why I couldn't go down to the shelter today like I had planned, just without him. I could meet a few dogs there, maybe fill out the paperwork to put one on hold, to meet James, if I found one that really clicked with me, get the ball rolling. Yeah, I thought, that'd be exactly the thing to do today. I fixed my hair in the bathroom mirror and grabbed a light jacket out of the closet. Since I didn't go out much, it always hung up in the closet upstairs so that it wouldn't clutter the downstairs closet. Then I made my way downstairs to put on my shoes and grabbed my car keys and wallet before climbing into the driver's seat of my little Accord. I had wanted a Jeep for a long time, but had never gotten around to making that happen. Besides, I didn't leave the house enough to justify buying myself a new vehicle when I already had a perfectly working one in the driveway. And any time I went anywhere with James, I always took his pride and joy anyway. My little Accord was in great shape regardless. Even though if we got a larger dog, it might justify getting a larger vehicle. As I pulled slowly through the driveway and down the long stretch of hill that led to the city, I allowed myself to dream a little bit. It would be really nice to pack up the dog into the Jeep and head out to a dog park or even hiking trails every weekend. Spend some time unplugged from work and everything else, some time outside of the house, even if it didn't involve a bunch of other people. A nice, big dog that would be intimidating enough that I wouldn't have to worry about anyone trying to mess with me when I was out in the woods alone on a trail, but friendly enough that I didn't have to worry about it being vicious or out of control around people. I didn't want an attack dog or anything like that, just a nice family pet that could be a protector if the need ever arose. I thought that was reasonable. Maybe a male dog, I thought. I had loved Bill. She was a sweet little thing. But she was hardly the protective sort. I figured a male dog might have a little bit more of that alpha dog instinct in it. That it would be nice to have in a companion, I thought. I could get one of those nice fluffy pet beds and lay it down in the bedroom on my side of the bed, since I was pretty sure James wouldn't want the dog sleeping in bed with us. If I moved around too much in my sleep, I'm fairly sure the big dog wouldn't be lying perfectly still either. By the time I pulled into the shelter parking lot and cut the engine, I was already primed and ready to find a new companion to share my life with. I just knew that this time I would find a dog that would actually be a good fit for me and James. I made my way inside and checked in at the front desk, filled out some paperwork, and was let into the back where the animals were kept. This shelter was a lot nicer than some of the other ones in the area. The shelter that we had got Bill from might as well have been a prison for those poor animals. You couldn't really meet them either. They were all locked up in cages, and a staff member would walk you around to pick up a dog or a cat, and that was pretty much it. Sight unseen, as it were. But not this shelter. It had pretty decent funding for the animals. I followed the signs on the wall that pointed me in the direction of B Wing, as it was called. This wing was for male canines, whereas A Wing was for females. C Wing was for cats, but I had no interest in a cat. Lovely, intelligent creatures, but hardly the companion that I was looking for right now. The door to B Wing was a large metal door, kind of like what you might expect to see in a prison, which made me uneasy. But once through the door, the atmosphere couldn't be more different. There were 2 rows of pens inside, along with beds and toys, water bowls and food bowls for the animals. Nice super sad puppy dog toys here, like those commercials on TV with that forlorn singer and her heart-wrenching song about angels and their arms. I made my way down the walkway slowly, looking at all of the pairs. Some were snoozing in their little beds or munching away at kibble from a bowl. One pair was curled up together, and another was playing tug-of-war with a rope toy. They all seemed to be pretty well taken care of, and happy enough. The glass wall that made up the front of each pen had a little plastic sleeve on each side of the glass, one for each dog, with a picture of the dog and information about the animal. They listed the name of each one, the vet's best guess as to the breed of animal and approximate age, where they were from, whether they were microchipped or spayed or neutered, etc. As I made my way down the hall, I stopped now and then to read up on some of the dogs, but none of them really jumped out at me. That was probably for the best, I thought. James would have to come down and meet them anyway, and I didn't want to get my heart set on a dog before he gave his approval. I reached the end of the hall and was just about to turn back to make my way out when I noticed tucked away in the very back of the pen on the far left side, a little black ball curled up in the corner. I almost didn't notice that the dog was there at first glance. I pulled up in front of the glass. There was a nice sleeve with paperwork for him anywhere. I wondered if that meant he was already in the process of being adopted. I knelt down in front of the glass to get a better look. Poor little guy, in a pen all by himself. When I did so, he perked his head up a little, and I could see that he was a husky, black and white, with piercingly clear blue eyes. He had a couple of black spots on his muzzle, and the mask around his eyes gave him a really mean and intimidating look, even for the little guy that he was. Because he was, I saw, still a puppy. No more than a couple of months old. Not the little fluffy bundle you'd like to think of a puppy being as on Christmas morning, but definitely shy of reaching adolescence. I smiled at him and called out. Not having a name to use, I just said, "Hi, little guy." He picked himself up the floor and walked to the window and sat down nearby, those blue eyes trained on me as if trying to say something, though I didn't know what. I talked to him a little bit, asking him his name, why he was all by himself, why he was hiding in the corner. He, of course, offered no reply, but he did tilt his head a little or give a soft wag of his tail in response to show that he was listening. He was perfect. I knew instantly. I stayed with him for about 20 minutes or so, and he curled up by the window to lay down and just hang out with me as I sat there on the floor. Finally, I let him know that I was going to talk to the staff about his paperwork and get his name so that I could refer to him properly. Maybe I would bring him out to the visiting room so he could sniff me and I could pet him. When I asked if he would like that, he lifted his head up off of his paws and blinked his blue eyes of his in such a deliberate fashion that I knew he would. "I'd be back soon," I told him. His ears drooped a little, as if he had heard that before and didn't believe me, but that was understandable. Poor little guy was still just a puppy and stuck in a shelter. Sure, it was a good shelter, but still, being abandoned at that young of an age had to suck, especially for a husky. I made my way back out towards the front desk and had to stand in line behind a couple of people who were filling out some paperwork to adopt a pet before I was able to reach the window and inquire about the husky in B-Wing. The girl behind the counter, while very friendly and eager to help, had no idea which husky I was talking about and asked me for his name so that she could look him up in the system. I explained that his pen had no paperwork on the window. I didn't know if that meant someone else was getting ready to adopt him or what. She looked at me quizzically for a moment before stating that I don't take the paperwork off the pen normally until after an animal had been picked up and brought home by a family, and couldn't understand why there would be a dog in a pen without the paperwork on it. She asked me to hang tight at the window for a few minutes while she went and found someone who could look into it and figure out what was going on, where the dog's paperwork was, so that she could give me a status on whether or not he was adoptable or already being adopted. I smiled and thanked her as she walked off with another woman behind her, and they both disappeared through a door out in the back, presumably headed to go check out the pen in question. That was a bit strange, I thought, for such a nice shelter that seemed to really have everything in such an orderly fashion. But then again, it was an office of sorts, and paperwork did have a tendency to get misplaced now and then, especially when it came to some place that had a lot of volunteers. Someone likely moved it for one reason or another and forgot to put it back. I was sure James would have had a good laugh about it tonight when I get home and tell him about my little adventure. About 5 minutes later, the receptionist girl came back, paperwork in hand, but rather than looking triumphant at locating the long prize, she wore a grim expression. I deflated in an instant. It must have been as I suspected originally. The lack of paperwork on his window must have meant that somebody else was already going to adopt him, that he was off the market, as it were. I steeled myself for the news and tried to keep myself from looking heartbroken. But I was wrong. Thor, as it turned out his name was not being adopted. His paperwork had been pulled by the veterinarian. He had been with the shelter for 30 days already without being adopted, and he was scheduled to be put down. The girl tried to smile a little smile with a practiced, apologetic sadness that said to me she had seen far too many animals put down already, and that was just the way of things, unfortunately. I was horrified. He hadn't been vicious or attacked anyone. He didn't have rabies or fleas and had a clean bill of health. But 30 days was all he had, all any animal in the shelter had, before being put down, because that was all they could afford to keep an animal for. 30 days. And they were going to put down this sweet, intelligent little husky because no one had come for him in 30 days' time. I'll take him, I said, without a second thought about it. I would just have to explain it to James when he got home. I was sure that he would understand. I knew Thor was the perfect companion for me, with all the long hours that James spent at work. He was an intelligent dog. I was sure it would be fine. The girl behind the counter looked at me with some sort of disbelief on her face. "Do you want to meet him first?" she asked, still a little uncertain about my sudden willingness to take him home. I said that I would love to meet him, but wanted to fill out the paperwork to adopt him first. That way, I said, when you bring him out to meet me, we can just leave together, instead of him having to go back into that pen. In truth, I was more than a little worried that something might happen if I didn't act quickly. The incident with the paperwork missing from Thor's pen had already shown that they didn't exactly have all of their ducks in a row. She gave me a form to fill in my name and address, information about my household income, what type of house I lived in, that kind of thing. I filled out all of the information as quickly as I could, then pulled out my debit card to pay the $125 adoption fee. I also bought a collar and a leash from the little spinning rack that they had there in the lobby, so that I would have something to take Thor out of the shelter with. I would buy something better once we left. Collar and leash in hand, paperwork completed, the receptionist called a handler over and gave her a little slip for Thor. We walked together through the door that led to the kennels and right into B-Wing. The handler unlocked the door to one of those little visitation rooms that they had set up and said that she would bring Thor out to meet me. I did not want to be a pain or get in the way of this woman's job, but I nonetheless asked if it would be alright if I was there when she took Thor out of the pen. She agreed and very kindly directed me down the hall towards the pen where I had met him before, while she would go around to an employee entrance in the back to pull him out. I nearly ran down the little hallway to where Thor was laying, still just right up against the glass where he had been. His head perked up when I squatted down by the window glass. "Well, hey there. Thor, is it?" I said, delighted to finally have his name. "How you doing, buddy? Told you I'd be back." He sat up so fast, I could barely believe it, his little tail thumping eagerly on the ground, his ears perked up as he looked at me. I told him that in just a minute here, a lady would be coming to open his pen and bring him out to meet me, so he would have to be on his best behaviour. He stood up on all fours then and blinked at me with that same deliberate blink of those piercing blue eyes of his, and I knew that he understood. Good boy, Thor. Any minute now. Aye, there she is. The back of the kennel opened, and the same handler that I was with just moments before appeared, with a thickly braided ripe leash in her hand. Thor trotted right up to her, planted his bottom on the ground, and waited patiently for her to hook him up. Once he was tethered, he looked back at me, his mouth open with an excited little pant, his tongue lolling out, and I nodded. "See you in just a minute, Thor," I said as they departed, and I nearly sprinted back up the hall towards the visitation room, past all of the other pens. A moment later, Thor and the handler appeared. She closed the door behind them and unclipped the leash from the collar Thor was wearing. He was so excited that his whole body was wriggling and rattling like his tail. When he was released, he went flying across the little space of the room to where I stood and jumped up on my legs. Laughing, I stooped down a little and he licked my face while I pat him. Yep, he was perfect. Smart little guy too. I couldn't understand why no one wanted him, but oh well, that was their loss. Once Thor had calmed down a little bit and got most of the licking out of his system, I asked if he wanted to come home with me, and the joyful jumping and licking took over all over again. We took that to mean a yes. I asked him to sit down so that I could take off the collar the shelter had on him, and he immediately planted his butt right down and sat still to let me do what I needed to do. So he already knew the sit command. That was good. I took the old collar off and handed it off to the new handler, and I put the new one on Thor with an apology that it was kind of ugly, and promised that we'd get him a new one soon. Once he was all set and ready, on a new collar and leash, the handler let us out and escorted us back to the front of the main entrance, bidding us good luck, and then we were out in the parking lot. Thor seemed to love the fresh air, even if it was just a city parking lot. After 30 days in a pen, I probably would have been bursting with energy too. The way he leapt along as we walked towards the car was as close to a skip as I imagine a dog could ever come. I unlocked the passenger door and let him in. I quickly realised that I was going to need to get one of those little doggy seatbelt contraptions for him. If I had time before picking him up, I would have already bought one, but, well, I wasn't planning on taking little man home so soon. Such things happened, and I reasoned to myself that he would be alright for just one car ride to the pet store. It wasn't very far away, and I am a pretty defensive driver. Besides, a lot of dog owners don't strap their dogs in as it was, and they always seem to be alright. One ride wouldn't hurt, and was definitely better than risking being put down while I was at the store. Thor hopped right up into the passenger seat without a problem, sitting proudly, his little chest pushed out. He even let me strap the seatbelt over him without an issue. We figured that would be better than nothing. Then I closed the door and walked around the car to get in the driver's seat. He got a little nervous when I first put the car into gear and started to pull out, not used to being out for car rides. But once I rolled down his window a little and he felt the air coming through, he seemed much more at ease. I chattered away at him as I drove us through the city to the big pet shop across town. You know the type, the one with the big red logo that lets you bring your pets inside the shop with you. Thor sat happily, riding shotgun, his keen eyes turning towards me every now and then. I knew that James would love him. The trip to the pet store was an adventure. Thor was the talk of the shop, with all the retail employees giving me and him compliments on his coat, his markings, the size of his paws. He was going to be a massive dog, they said. And just how well behaved he was. For he did indeed just trot right alongside me and sat calmly while I got a new collar and leash, food bowls, a seatbelt restraint, a nice big fluffy bed, and all the toys and treats that I could. Yes, I spoiled him. I admit that. It wasn't until I was pulling into the driveway with Thor that I realised that I hadn't told James there would be a new friend to meet when he got home. James's car still wasn't in the driveway. It was nearly 6:30 at this point. I expected him to be home and passed out in bed. Poor thing. I pulled out my phone and sent off a text to James before letting myself and Thor out of the car and towards the door of the house. Thor didn't take the time to stop and sniff anything, just trotted right up to the door and sat like a good boy while I unlocked it and let us in. I had been kind of worried about the whole process, what with dragging so many bags and a huge bed into the house at the same time, but he was on his best behaviour. He even wiped his paws on the front mat before going inside. Such a little gentleman, Thor. Once we were inside, and I put things down in the entryway, I reached down to unhook the leash from Thor's collar. He sat, perfectly still and patient, while I did so, then made his way through the house. He did not wander about, sniffing everything and getting the layout of the house, as I would have expected him to, though. Instead, he made his way slowly and deliberately down the hall, away from the door, towards the stairs that led to the second floor, as if he already knew where he was going. He stopped and sat at the bottom of the stairs, and looked at me with those gorgeous blue eyes of his, as if he were waiting for me. Taking the hint with a little laugh, I grabbed his bag and dragged it up the stairs. He darted around me and stood at the top until I reached him. Then he led me over to the bedroom door, which stood closed, as it usually did, and just waited patiently. He must be really excited to lay down on this giant blue floof of a pillow bed that we had bought. I opened the door and I bounded at once onto James' side of the bed, laying down and reeling himself into place. I snorted in laughter as I placed the dog bed on the floor near my side of bed. "No, Thor, down. Your bed is here." Thor gave me a deliberate blink and a little snort, as if to suggest that I was kidding. I repeated myself, and this time he slunk quietly off the bed. He was such a good listener. I couldn't imagine what problems some other family must have had with him. If he was upset about not getting to sleep in the bed, it didn't last long. He pounced onto his doggy bed and rolled over and over, sniffling and snorting, and just generally being a happy little puppy a moment later. I smiled while watching him, then went to straighten out the bed. Once that was taken care of, I made my way down to the kitchen, setting up his food and water bowls and filling each, Thor following along beside me, like he didn't want to let me out of his sight. I chattered happily at Thor while I sat in the kitchen, making dinner for myself and James. Since I didn't know when he would be home, I decided I would just pack up his meal for him in the refrigerator to be reheated when he got here, and eat alone. Well, I wouldn't be alone. I would have Thor. That thought made me smile, as I spooned cooked rice and steamed vegetables and chicken into a container for James, and into a bowl for myself. I would never have to eat dinner alone again, just because James was working late. Poor James. Thor and I made our way to the living room, and he curled up on the sofa next to me, while I switched on the local news and ate my meal. I was surprised that he did not sit there begging for scraps, as Bella had done. but he was perfectly content to just watch the news with me. The mayor was apologising for his statements during the most recent town hall. The local high school was having a charity drive. I put my empty bowl down on the coffee table and Thor scooched over to put his head in my lap, and I scratched his ears while I watched the rest of the news. Groundbreaking on the new construction project downtown was the start on Monday. There was a 3-car accident on the highway near town that left 2 in critical condition. The new virus from the east was spreading rapidly throughout Europe, and we should all be very, very afraid of what that meant. I switched off the TV after a while and stood up, making my way back to the kitchen to wash up the dinner dishes. The news was already the same old things, and I honestly didn't know why I bothered to watch it anymore. It was just a habit, I supposed. James liked to watch the news when he was getting home from work, so I would always watch it with him. I suppose it was kind of silly that I watched it, even without him there, when I didn't really enjoy it, but I guess I've always been a creature of habit. When I finished up the dishes, Thor ran over to the back door and sat by it with the smallest little yip. I took that to mean he had to go outside. I told him to wait right there for just a moment, and I'd grab his leash as I headed back towards the hook by the door, where I had hung the leash up with my keys, and made my way back to Thor, amazed at how lucky I was if he was already housebroken, and shook my head at the fact that he almost had to be put down because no one wanted him. Thor and I made our way out into the yard with him on the leash. The yard wasn't fenced in or anything, and I didn't have a lead or a dog run set up yet. I would have to take care of that soon for him. I'm sure he'd probably prefer that. This time, Thor did make his way around slowly, sniffing and pawing at the grass here and there before finding the perfect place to lift his leg and mark his territory. We made our way around the yard, with him repeating the process several times, slowly heading out back towards and then behind the garage. We figured this was some part of male dog marking territory ritual, and went along as Thor sniffed about every inch of the yard. Until something suddenly excited him, and he jerked hard against the leash with so much force and so unexpectedly that it flew right out of my hand as he bolted towards the far corner of the garage, where our property line met with some woods. He had been so good this whole time on the leash that I hadn't been paying as much attention to it as I should have been, and I called out for him at once, hoping he wasn't about to disappear into the woods or be lost. Great job, Ophelia. Leaves the dog on the first day home from the shelter. Luckily for me, perhaps, Thor didn't try to run off into the woods. Instead, he darted full speed for a spot just at the edge of the property, where it met the piles of old leaves, and began digging frantically. Old leaves and chunks of dirt flying up from underneath his paws to rain down in a shower of debris and pebbles. I ran over to him and slammed my foot down on the end of the leash so that I wouldn't lose my opportunity to regain it if he tried to take off again, before reaching down to pick up the little loop in my hand. Thor paid me no mind at all, just kept right on digging, furiously and almost ferociously. He was panting, either from the excitement or the effort, I don't know. Panting, sniffling, snorting. I called out to him once I had his leash in hand and wrapped around my forearm a couple of times. Thor, come on, stop digging up the yard. He paid no attention, just kept right on digging. Thor, come on, I said, giving his leash a decent tug. Whatever fervour he had been in stopped just then. and he turned around towards me, sitting his butt down on the little mound of dirt that he had unearthed, and turning those startlingly blue eyes on me, all the more brilliantly bright in the semi-dim light of the early evening. And there, dangling from his mouth, was something. I couldn't make out what it was. I stared at it as it swayed slightly in the air with each panting breath Thor took, and yet I could not make sense of what I was seeing. The pink, soft leather was tarnished and tattered. Here and there, flecks of the leather were even beginning to unpeel, and it was covered in places with dried dirt and specks of old mud, maybe? Yeah, that's what it was. Dried old mud. "That's a nasty thing, Thor," I said, trying to force myself into a calm that I did not feel, so that I wouldn't risk scaring him with my tone. Why don't you spit that out? There's a good boy." And started to slowly coax him away from the hole. He wasn't scared, but he knew I was. Those strangely intelligent eyes didn't miss what was going on here. I reached for whatever he had been holding in his jaws and dropped it right there in the yard as we walked back around the garage to the door that leads to the kitchen, swallowing hard as I went. I got Thor into the house and brought him upstairs to his bed. We gave him a stuffed bear that we had bought at the pet store and told him that I would be back, doing my best to smile. I closed the bedroom door behind me quietly, and he seemed to understand to stay. I made my way slowly through the house, almost in a daze, barely breathing, stopping every so often to squeeze my eyes closed and tell myself that it would be okay. I found a flashlight and grabbed one of James's coats from the downstairs closet before heading out the back door into the backyard again, around the garage to the edge of my property, and knelt down, shining the flashlight around to where I had dropped it. The thing that Thor found before making my way over to the hole that Thor had just dug. I held my breath, pulling my bottom lip up a little between my teeth, and knelt down, reaching my hand into the hole to move some of the dirt around it gently, fighting the urge not to cry, or scream, or run. I don't know which I felt at this time. Maybe all three. Because there, right in the shallow grave, at the edge of my property line, unmarked, unattended, unknown, poor Belle lay covered unceremoniously with dirt, and I held her collar, covered in her blood and old, cold dirt, in my hand.